The first 2 days of the 2025 NFL Draft are in the books, and the Eagles have added 2 players to the roster: linebacker Jahad Campbell from Alabama and safety Andrew Mukumba from Texas. So look, I'm not going to break down these players as if I was glued to Alabama or Texas tape or wherever the hell they were before that. I know Andrew Mukumba was at, I believe, Clemson. I'm not going to act like I was scouring the internet to watch highlight film. I wasn't. Let's just talk about the positions because that's what we know. We have no idea as NFL fans if these picks will pan out, if they're good, if they're bad. I often laugh at NFL draft grades, which are given out post-draft, because the reality is we have no idea. I often think back to, and I have to give credit to PFT from Barstool on this, he brought up a famous post-draft grade of the Seattle Seahawks when they took Russell Wilson, and they crushed that draft. They built a championship roster from that draft, and this particular post-draft grade just ripped them to shreds. So the reality is, I can sit here and I can give you a grade. I don't know. You don't know. No one knows. Jahad Campbell could be the greatest player of all time, and Andrew Mukumba could be the greatest safety we've seen since Brian Dawkins, or they could end up being Jason Short, and let's go with Macho Harris. But let's talk about the positions because that's what we know that the Eagles addressed. I was a little surprised in round one that they ended up going with a linebacker because it seemed like that was actually a position group of strength. You signed back Zack Baun, which I think for me and a lot of Eagles fans out there was the number one priority entering the offseason, was bringing back Zack Baun. Zack Baun no matter what. It wasn't Vontae Mack. It was Zack Baun. They did that. Great. You add in, though, the linebacking core that they have. I mean, technically, Nolan Smith is a linebacker. I don't know how many people actually view him as a linebacker. Like, I view him as more of a defensive end hybrid type, but more of a pass rushing defensive end. But nonetheless, he's technically a linebacker. You know, you add in Jeremiah Trotter, who look good. You do lose Oren Burks, who ended up looking really good when Nakobe Dean was out, but Nakobe Dean's coming back from injury. So there's, I guess, in a way that there is a need for this position, but I just didn't think it was overall a pressing need enough to address it in round one. With that said, Campbell was a player that on the experts board was rated very, very highly. And to get that kind of player at the 32nd overall pick, it reminds you a little bit of when they took Nolan Smith and when Nolan Smith dropped for virtually no reason. Howie Roseman has made really his bones in the draft of recent years by capitalizing on those guys that just happen to fall. And you don't really know why they're falling, but they fall. I mean, you think back to Cooper DeJean a year ago. No one could figure out why Cooper DeJean kept falling. Howie Roseman's like, I can't figure this out either, but let me go do something about it. He ends up trading up with Washington, grabbing Cooper DeJean, and we all know what happened with that. So Howie's kind of made a living on doing this and taking guys that for whatever reason, a Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, they drop, you capitalize, and you end up getting a really good player. With the safety position, I was a little bit surprised with that as well. I thought the team had a little bit more faith in Sidney Brown, and I thought that a group of Reed Blankenship, Sidney Brown, I thought that would be a good safety group, but obviously the Eagles thought differently. You got to remember, too, like Sidney Brown was coming off an injury last year. You haven't gotten a ton of tape on him. I'm not complaining about taking Mukumba, and I'm not complaining about taking a safety in general. I was just a bit surprised. But when I look back on what I personally wanted the Eagles to do, and I made a video about this, I wanted them to take right tackle of the future, and I wanted them to take a tight end. And when I look at the tackle position, tackles kept going, okay, fine. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to rip them to shreds for taking a position that if everything breaks correctly, you don't end up seeing them on the field in round one. It's a future pick. You're doing it for the future of the franchise, not necessarily next year. You're doing it for the year after and the year after that. You don't necessarily know if you took a tackle where that guy, when he would even play, because it could end up being a situation with Lane Johnson like it was with Jason Peters, where you thought every year was going to be the end, and he ended up kind of just sticking around for like 3-4 years. Jason Peters, I felt like was a little different because Andre Dillard just sucked. But even though that's what I would have personally wanted them to do, I didn't have a name. And when a guy like Campbell drops, okay, fine. Then you look at the second round, and I think ideally the Eagles probably would have wanted to go after a tight end in round 2, just like they did years earlier with Dallas Goedert, and just like they did years before that with Zach Ertz. But as the draft started to materialize, those tight ends weren't dropping. It wasn't like a year earlier with the cornerbacks that were dropping, like Cooper DeJean, as I just talked about. Tight ends weren't dropping; they were going where they were kind of predicted to go. After the draft ended on Friday, Howie Roseman did speak to the media, and he mentioned how he was looking to trade up, but the price to trade up was just too rich for his liking. I thought it was a really interesting tweet that Zach Berman from PHLY put out about Howie Roseman, and it's this philosophy with the draft, and it's just getting as many picks as possible, which makes sense. I mean, the past couple of years, it's like you constantly are hearing, well, over the next two drafts, the Eagles have 157 picks. Well, in the next 3 drafts, the Eagles have, because they look to trade out, and they look to accumulate assets and accumulate future picks, and it dates back to, and I don't remember the exact draft, but there was a draft where the Eagles didn't have a 5th-round pick. Howie Roseman punished himself by walking laps around the building until they were up to remind himself to never put himself in a position to not have a pick in a round. When you factor that in, when you factor the fact that he's not going to want to give up a ton of assets and leave them in a position where they only have, let's say, 4 picks in a draft, maybe 5 picks in a draft, and ironically, they kind of had that in 2018, which is really where Howie Roseman ended up making a lot of his money, that 2018 draft class with Mailata and Josh Sweat and Avonte Maddox and Dallas Goedert. But he doesn't want to do that anymore. He doesn't want to put himself in a position where he only has, let's say, 4, 5, or 6 picks. So because of that, you're not going to want to give up a bunch of assets to trade up in the second round from the last pick in the second round. You're not going to want to trade up because that price is expensive. So I think as the draft materialized and you looked at, okay, ideally, yeah, we would want a tight end. You've got Dallas Goedert going this last year, as I brought up in the previous video about why trading Dallas Goedert would be foolish. You're not going to really want to usher in the Grant Calcaterra era. And I don't think they're going to do that next year. But they're putting themselves in a position, though, where I feel like next year and in the draft, everybody's going to know they're going to be looking at tight end because I doubt that they end up re-signing Dallas Goedert. There's just a lot of mileage on that body. He's not finishing seasons healthy. Overall, though, I mean, I can't complain about what they did. They got hopefully 2 guys that are going to impact the team next year. They did lose a lot, especially on the defensive side. You end up trading C.J. Gardner-Johnson. Well, hopefully you just replaced him with Andrew Mukumba. And because of Nakobe Dean's injury, you can put Campbell in a linebacking position, or you could just have him rush the quarterback, and they do need rushers. So I don't necessarily have a problem with what they did. I'm not over the moon about it. I'm interested to talk to some people that actually follow college football, but there's really no complaints. It's not backflips like it was the previous year when you end up stealing Quinyon Mitchell and everybody knew that he was the number 1 cornerback in the draft and you didn't have to trade up or back for it, and you end up getting Cooper DeJean around too. That was backflips galore and ended up panning out. This year's a little bit different, but it's going to be interesting to see what the Eagles do on day 3 because they ended up trading out twice of the 3rd round, and they've put themselves in a position where they're going to have a decent amount of picks in rounds 4, 5, 6, and 7. So a lot of times you kind of end up making your roster that way in rounds 4, 5, 6, and 7. Like Andy Reid, if you look at his drafts, typically speaking, he didn't really hit a lot of times on the top picks, but he would hit on the Jason Kelce's, the Trent Coles, and I'm drawing a blank on his name, so smash that thumbs down button for this. Todd Harriman's 4th round, that was the guy I was thinking of. He would end up hitting on those guys, and the top picks that you were expecting to make that impact, the Victor Abiamiris of the world, they would end up busting. So, look, the draft is a crapshoot. I think we all know that, but early returns, at least from my opinion, is the Eagles ended up picking guys that, at least in round 1, had, for whatever reason, dropped, and you end up taking kind of best player available in that situation, and Jahad Campbell. He should make an impact next year. In round 2, you end up taking a need in safety, and Andrew Mukumba, but it still leaves them with a hole at tight end. I do think they'll address tight end in day 3, but once again, that's kind of a Grant Calcaterra spot. That doesn't mean that you can't get a good player. I've just mentioned a couple guys that Andy Reid hit on in day 3 of the draft. Well, one of those guys was Brent Selleck. He was a 5th-round pick out of Cincinnati. Maybe you get another Brent Selleck. Maybe you get another really good tight end who ends up having a decent and Eagles career and ends up being your number one guy for a while. We'll see. But overall, it's a good thing that the Eagles were drafting last because that means that they won the goddamn Super Bowl. So go Birds.